Yes, allow me just to pause the note that please feel free to interrupt me as you wish. I want this more to be of a conversation rather than a lecture. Of course, I do have some data to support the argument, but I want this to be more of a conversation. I want to know what you're interested to know. Obviously, now as we dive deeper into this, food systems is a very large interface for us to be digging deep into, and philanthropy usually try to focus on areas of impact, and that's what I want to learn from you. Uh, I'll start with a global outlook, and just to note that at the regional level, for the MENA region, there isn't really this regional outlook on what initiatives are there, what's happening. We don't have that drafted. So I think the best way for you to do so and to gain that knowledge is to sit down with speakers such as myself and the other speakers and really listen to what kind of engagements that they're participating in so that you can have the outlook that you're looking for. In case that is not found in a report at the regional level. My work is more at the global level. I currently work with the World Benchmarking Alliance, assessing 350 of the most influential companies on the face of the planet in food and agriculture. And what we try to call for is corporate accountability and to close that accountability gap. So I usually work with the FAO, with the UN Food Systems Summit Coordination Hub to try to embed a framework for corporate accountability. But also, I do the youth part, as Aditi just mentioned, also at the global level with youth from across the world, bridging between the country where I'm based in Lebanon, to the region of the MENA, and then globally to the global agenda policy interspaces such as COP and the Food Systems Summit. That the stock take happened just in July, and we do know that COP this year will be a stock take, and it's also midpoint between the Paris Agreement and the 2030 SDG agenda. So, to go into it without further ado, um, the 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 connection between climate and food security, and hence I also want to cut to the chase a lot so that we don't spend too much time on this. But in the MENA region, there is or there is this tendency to focus a lot when it comes to food security on production. What do we need to produce? And this is in confidence with the conversations I usually have with the ministers of agriculture from the MENA region at these global interspaces. And so to give sort of a comprehensive outlook on what is the what is the connection between climate, biodiversity, nutrition, health, and food security, so that it is not only focused on producing more and providing more, but that there are different dependencies that are also arising from the production of food. So we do know from now from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, as referenced by them, that a 2023 progress assessment of SDG number two, which is zero hunger, based on assessed targets of the SDG number two, shows stagnation or regression. That means that we are not on track to meet the SDG number two by 2030. We are not on track to eliminate zero hunger by 2030. And so the world is off track to meet this target by 2030. And we actually see more regression than positive outcomes. There is a triple challenge when it comes to food in food systems and its relation to food security. One is health related. Second is small scale producers related. And third is climate and nature related. And that's the triple challenge that we're always trying to work with. How are the farmers and the small scale producers affected? What is the relation to human rights and generally the people working along the value chain? How is this affecting them in the food system? How are the products we are producing affecting people's health and their nutrition, and vice versa? How are people's demand for food products affecting the environment as well? And third, again, would be to look at biodiversity loss and climate change through specifically scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions arising from or at the production level. One thing we do know is that biodiversity loss is mainly driven by the production of food on the face of the planet. Most biodiversity loss is caused by food production. We also know that to meet the SDG agenda by 2030, we need to halt deforestation by 2025, which is right, in 1 year from now almost. Otherwise, we cannot meet the Paris Agreement as well of remaining within 1.5 degrees. And this is all caused by the food systems and the interdependencies of them. Now, yes, I have been asked a lot of questions regarding deforestation when it comes to tropical areas in specific in Africa, in specific the Congo Basin and West Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. Now, that some countries share a common narrative that in Scandinavia or in very arid climates such as the ones in the Middle East and North Africa, the deforestation narrative is not really present, and that is because of the external footprint of the consumption. Um, we do know, and this is a fact, that more than 50% of food eaten in the MENA region is imported, and that is a huge deal. And so most of the policies in the MENA region are focused on increasing domestic production of food, and that is something that we will cover as well. But when it comes to health and nutrition, these are the statistics. More than 800 million people are undernourished. 3 billion people don't have access to healthy diet. 2.5 billion people are overweight at the same time. And 150 million children under the age of 5 are suffering from stunting. And these are according to the latest SOFI report published by the FAO. When it comes to small scale producers, we do know that farmers and fishers are still not provided with a decent living income that covers their own needs and their family's needs. We know that women still need to be further empowered at the production level as well. And we do know that out of 575 million farms on planet Earth, 500 of them are less than 2 hectares, and that are controlled specifically by small scale producers. When it comes to climate and nature, the very big statistic that comes to mind that is always mentioned at COP is that a third of greenhouse gas emissions are derived from food systems. And that's a big deal when it comes to COP and greenhouse gas emissions and climate and food security. A third of greenhouse gas emissions are attributed to our global food systems, and a lot of that comes from the deforestation part. At the same time, as well, a third of our food is either lost or wasted, and that's also another issue. And I think a year or 2 years back for West Asia, there was the first report from UNEP, the UN Environment Program, on the state of food loss and waste for the West Asian region, and a lot of that was attributed actually to religious events such as Ramadan and others as well. And I would really advise for you to take a look at that. We also know that 50% of our agricultural lands at the global level are moderately to severely degraded by now, and that is because of the industrial practices that we run over these lands. And also, another big statistic that we've been talking about for many years now is that almost 70% of the global freshwater use on the planet is used for agriculture and not for domestic supply or industrial production. It's used for agriculture. And lastly, as I said, the food systems are the primary driver of biodiversity loss. So why am I saying this? Because we need to be very careful when we decide what to produce and the quantities we produce because of the effects it has on people's health, nutrition, the climate, biodiversity, and people's rights. So it is a food system that we must take a look at, intertwined, it is connected, and every action we take to solve will definitely have its effect along the value chain, and it will impact also more than a billion or 2 billion people working directly in agriculture. Let me stop there with too much statistics for now and see, what is your interest there? Which statistics really come to your mind and, are really spoken out for you?
Thank you, Ryan. That's such a great overview of the issues, and it feels that there's so many, and those numbers aren't improving, as you said, right? Like we're way off meeting the 2030 zero hunger targets, and so much of land is degraded and everything. And like, it's a very basic question, but where do you start? Right? It's so interconnected and it's so far-reaching. Kind of the degradation that we're seeing on nature and on food systems and on diets. Like, how would you kind of strategically start moving resources, which is, philanthropic capital, for example, to start addressing some of these issues, which I hope in turn will have kind of a waterfall effect on some of the others, right? Like, have you seen any kind of government strategic plans that you think really make sense and are really holistic, or any organizations doing some great work in kind of addressing these multitude of issues?
Sure thing. Actually, would you like me to jump first of all to a little bit of the regional outlook when it comes to the MENA region, so that we can try to zoom in and see why the government policies and the actions taken by civil society are the way they are for this region, so just so that we understand. Um, First of all, and these are also very recent data, from the IMF and the World Bank as well. We know now that Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, Sudan, and South Sudan are hunger hotspots and or are countries at high risk of or already in debt distress. So we have hunger, we have debt, so we have an economic crisis in a lot of these countries, and we have conflict. Between 25 to 39% of the Arab population is food insecure. 25 to 39%. Undernourishment is more prevalent in Western Asia with an average of 10.8%. So most of the undernourishment and the hunger can be seen in West Asia rather than North Africa specifically. In Western Asia, many countries benefited from increased oil revenues, but these did not always translate into lower levels of hunger in 2022. And again, mentioning one, political instability in some countries and conflicts have continued to disrupt food supplies, markets, and distribution systems, resulting in higher food prices and food shortages, which is one of the main issues for insecurity in the region. The second is domestic inflation of food prices as well has soared in several countries, making access to food more difficult. These are the primary two drivers of food insecurity in the MENA region: political conflict and instability, and second is domestic inflation due to economic crises. And so more philanthropic support, and this is a statement as well, in high-risk countries such as the one we mentioned, is devoted to food aid. And that's something that you will notice in a lot of these Western Asian and North African countries. The philanthropic support is devoted to food aid through the implementing partners, usually either through UN agencies such as the World Food Program, UNICEF, FAO, and UNRWA, or as civil society organizations working specifically with refugees. And that is one of the issues we were discussing at the Lebanese parliament 2 months ago when we convened all the food systems actors in the same room in the country to discuss who is doing what on food in Lebanon so that the parliament can support that at the policy level at the food systems hub or the food system stock taking moment. And most of it that we also mentioned when we had our discussions in Syria and Jordan and Yemen and in other countries as well is the food aid focus. Now, usually when we look at the system level issue, we see food aid as a band-aid solution. It is a short-term solution. And it is not the solution or the actual solution to eradicate the root cause of the issue. Usually, it is actually not a solution within food systems at all. So when it comes to political instability, it is a climate or it is a Security Council issue that must be resolved so that food security can be resolved as well. So sometimes it spans across or outside the food systems itself. Um, And that's where the millions of dollars are being poured into these food aid projects. And now you have an interdependency as well. And that is a very hard conversation we had with some of these local NGOs that are now relying very strongly on this philanthropic support to deliver food aid. Because from one end, that is a band aid solution. From another end, because of the economic crisis in these countries, the local population is now benefiting as well from a job market, from these civil society organizations and the philanthropic support being poured into food aid. But yet again, that is not a long-term solution to eradicate the root cause. A small trend can be seen in the rise of entrepreneurs and small to medium enterprises that are providing healthy products that are nutritious, organic, and climate friendly. We can see that in several countries in the MENA region. However, these products are still not affordable to the general population, especially those who are food insecure. They cannot afford them. And they still require an adaptive or like an adaptive strategy to change the consumption habits because sometimes they're a little bit off track when it comes to the Mediterranean or Middle Eastern diet as well. Let me do another pause. Back to you, Adi.
Thank you. As I think as Ryan said at the start, if anyone wants to chip in with questions, please do come off mute and ask away, whether it's a question, reflection. I think on that point, kind of that most of the philanthropic capital goes to food aid, for me is shocking. Like, why is that? Is that shifting, changing over the last couple of years, or is that an increasing trend? I'll let you kind of hold that question, but also invite in Marie to share hers in case it's related, or you can pick which one to answer first.
Yeah, hi. Hello, Ryan. My questions for you is that I want to know in this, what was the parliamentary role really, and what strategy did they adopt, like for what you were talking about, like in Lebanon?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure thing. I'll start with the second question. The FAO Food Systems Summit that was established in 2021 now is requiring every country on the planet to submit a national pathway, which acts as a national strategy for food systems that are aligned with the global agenda and that are agreed with the principles set out in the Food Systems Summit. So, in this action to try to create Lebanon's first national pathway, the national convener of Lebanon, who's a parliamentarian as well, has asked for all the food system stakeholders in the country, from UN, civil society, and government agencies as well as youth-led organizations, to convene in the parliament and discuss and present what are the different stakeholders doing when it comes to food systems. And that's what we found as well. So now Lebanon's national pathway will be drafted, and it should be finalized within the next month, I hope so. And then it should be submitted to the Food Systems Coordination Hub at the FAO in Rome. And then in 2025, there will be a stock take. So then Lebanon will have to report against its progress to meet the targets set out in its own national pathway. And that's how the FAO Food Systems Hub is working with the national conveners of each country. On the first question regarding food aid, now, Aditi, there is no report that shows how these trends are moving forward. What is the most trends? Of course, I am sharing based on my own experiences, and as I said at the beginning, it would be very wise to consult several people working on food systems in the region so that you can create your own idea of what is happening, because that still we don't have that data. It's not compiled yet. What I can see from working with the ministers and the national conveners of these countries is that the trend is still focused on, one, increasing domestic food supply, and second is having those band-aid solutions or those interventions for acute food insecurities in countries with conflict through food aid. Is that on the rise? I cannot really tell you, but I know that it is not slowing down anytime soon. And unfortunately, that is sometimes creating a social political issue, because the longer you run it, the more people think that now it is a long-term solution, and now they're basing a job market off of it. And so it's really difficult to stop the reliance on these food aid projects, because they are becoming a long-term solution, and even the funding schemes are becoming a long-term issue. Usually they used to intervene for 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, and then usually wars would stop, or or political stability would be seen. But now, unfortunately, we can see this becoming a much longer. Every conflict you see is a longer conflict, so the food aid is also becoming a longer project. And that, I mean, that's what we know for now, at least, that we can see. And the national conveners are fully in support of this, because some of them are in countries where there's economic instability, and so they cannot step in to disregard the support needed by food aid agencies.
Thank you. Erica, you want to come in?
Yeah, thanks. Hi, Ryan and everyone. So I guess I'm curious what the conversation is, and kind of the position of the region in terms of harnessing technology to kind of address some of these issues. And, you know, a lot of the tech is quite cost heavy. And I think, you know, maybe there's an opportunity for philanthropy to support some of those things. But we also know that tech, anyways, there's a bunch of issues and caveats around implementing tech. But yeah, I guess what's the kind of conversation in the region around that, and the innovations in agriculture and stuff like that are also like climate resilient in some ways. Thanks.
Hi, Erica. All right. So for that question, we did a challenge about a year ago with the World Economic Forum, supported by the government of Saudi Arabia. And it was exactly to have a challenge where you would win $100,000, I think, for tech innovations in or for producing food in semi-arid environments, such as those in desert areas. And that's what you see usually, is that one, you want to, or the trends that we are trying to uh, show is, one, increasing domestic agriculture production and decreasing the reliance on food imports. Second is they're really trying, and especially in the Gulf, the like Arabian Gulf, they're trying to enhance research and innovative technology, so that they can produce food, so that they can increase domestic food supply. Like, some countries don't need that; they need more of a resource management strategy when it comes to their fresh water use, and soil and biodiversity laws. But in those arid, very arid regions, the focus is on these innovative technologies. Now, right now, research is the primary area where that philanthropic support is going into. Unfortunately, that research, and that is another statement as well from my side, is that, one, a lot of the philanthropic support is from outside the region itself, and second, that the research is also being led by institutes that are outside the region itself again. And so that's another issue, because you need to rely on that indigenous knowledge as well at some point. For now, a lot of these institutes are being supported, especially with the government of the United Arab Emirates, really supporting that, with the universities in Saudi Arabia, with the institutes that they have in innovative agricultural production, but also within technologies. Is there a need? Yes, the need is still there. The technologies are still there. But this is where I will ask you the questions and make my own statement through here, is that there is a lot of areas where the philanthropic support can come into. It can go into UN organizations that are trying to provide that food aid. It can go to governments in order to support fiscal policies, for example. it could go to civil society organizations, it could go to these startups that we talked about, or these research institutes. And so my question to you guys is, what are the kinds of projects that you're looking to fund? And second is, what type of impact are you looking to make? Because you can make an impact at the policy level, you can make an impact when it comes to implementation on the ground, you can make an impact when it comes to advocacy, for example. That's an area that is highly lacking in the MENA region. You can make an impact when it comes to the value chains, so from a bottom-up approach as well. You can even focus on consumers and how do you influence consumer habits, and as well, you can also focus on academia and increasing that database that is really lacking in the region. So I think, if we can limit that to zoom into one area that you would feel most comfortable with. Now, I'm sure you might have that question in your mind. Will you tell me where the area where the biggest impact is? I still don't have that answer as well. But what I can tell you is from my own experience, um, the this is my personal recommendation. Try to look into the areas where nobody else is looking, because everybody is looking into innovative technologies. Nobody is looking into nature-based solutions, for example. Everybody is looking into increasing domestic food supply. The Minister of Agriculture in Lebanon is always talking about, let's increase wheat production, let's make more bread. The Lebanese people love bread, let's make more bread. But not taking into consideration, are we going back to a Mediterranean diet? What is the full nutrient profile that is needed for these individuals to be happy, or be nutritious as well? And so I personally see that there is a huge lag in civil society organizations building a movement around food and advocating for new policies. Usually it is that, or we assume that the region is fine when it comes to food. All we need is to tackle the food insecurity issue by producing more food. If we can produce it because of environmental reasons and climate change reasons, then we invest in technologies that would allow us to increase this food, or like the food supply. But what about alternative diets, alternative proteins, going back to the chickpea lifestyle that we have? What about the farmers and their livelihoods? What about the external footprint we have? I do know that, for example, in Lebanon, I'm sorry I have to reference Lebanon a lot, but I do have that information directly from the ministers. That almost 70% of that chicken supply we have is coming from Brazil. And now then you have the ambassador of Brazil sitting down with the Minister of Agriculture in Lebanon and discussing, there's a huge deforestation issue that is attributed to the Lebanese population. The same thing goes with overconsumption when it comes to the population living in oil-producing countries in the MENA region. They have obesity and overweight, while at the same time their neighbors are food insecure and suffering from malnutrition. So I think we can also zoom in on sub-regions within the region. Let me stop there and take it back to you.
Thank you. Patricia, come on in.
Yeah. Hi, Diane. Thank you. One thing I always think about too is whether there's food being moved across borders in the region. And it's not a topic I know a lot about. So are there gaps that can be filled within the wider Middle East? In Dubai, so much of the produce historically is coming from Europe when you have other countries nearby growing things. Like my experience is mostly in Iraq, and there's a massive push, an agriculture push there. And one of the main reasons they haven't exported is because they don't have cardboard boxes. And so at least in Kurdistan, the government has recently funded a cardboard box production so they can export produce. But I also wonder if there's some sort of way to address some of the issues. I mean, the climate issue is pervasive across the entire region, but that was one question. The other one is whether there's a model to follow. Maybe there's one country or countries or areas where there are civil society groups that are really active. Maybe Lebanon is one. I know there are a lot of grassroots nature initiatives in particular, but thank you.
Lovely question. Hello, Patricia. For the first question, yes, there has been a difficulty or at least a challenge with meeting international standards for food exports, and especially when it comes to the European Union. I do know that now countries in Western Asia and specific are trying to meet these criteria through the food production, but that also holds another issue, which comes to your second question about the movement. I would definitely take a look at Tunisia and Morocco, but in specific Tunisia, where a lot of these global companies that I assess as well in my work are now imposing what the local farmers have to produce, and that comes into hand on the issue of seed sovereignty. Who produces what, and why are you producing it, and what seeds are produced? Indigenous seeds or seeds produced by these international companies such as Bayer and others. And so hence there are really like a justice lens when it comes to these exports as well. I do know that there are conflicting opinions between governments because at the same time, governments want to increase domestic supply, but at the same time, they want the supply to be exported because they need foreign currencies, because they have an economic situation. At the same time, these local communities producing the food are suffering from food insecurity, and most of the food they produce is not really consumed by them, but it is really exported because of the need for the foreign currency, because of the economic situation. So I would definitely send you some links to some organizations from Tunisia and from Morocco. One also is from Iraq, Lebanon, and Jordan, uh, doing some justice work. And I can see that the divide between the government policies and the local indigenous or like the local farmers is really divided, and the conversation isn't really on the table. And just facilitating that roundtable between what is the government trying to do and what are the local farmers, the local people suffering from when it comes to this increased production would be something really important, because when we put the farmers from Tunisia, and I would also really support that you sit down with the Arab Reform Initiative. I think you have a session coming up with them. And really do ask Sareen, ask her about the experience that we had, because they convene like an annual dialogue with food systems agents from across the MENA region, and that conversation was really interesting when it comes to a just transition. What is a just transition when it comes to food systems in the MENA region? And that's something that usually is not funded, is not talked about, and it's really important. What is a just transition? What are these local farmers suffering from when it comes to indigenous and local knowledge, when it comes to their seed sovereignty as well? And those are the areas that are not really focused on.
Thank you. Any reflections you want to share back, Patricia? Or
No, nothing. I think it's, I guess, or maybe something. It is interesting to think about like exporting outside of the region versus within. And I guess, Rayan, I hadn't thought about the currency point, which makes complete sense why the incentive would be to export outside. But yeah, looking forward to the links of those organizations. Thank you.
great, thank you. Does anybody else want to come with a question? Got a couple, but we'll pause on them to give others a chance. Rosie?
Thanks, Ryan. It's really interesting. I heard you mention quite a few times that there's sort of lots of funding and money coming from outside the region into the region. What's happening inside the region in terms of philanthropic funding? Is there much, and how can funders in the area, in the space within the region, do more for the region?
Sure thing. Again, I would start first of all with saying that we don't have a report to show that outlook. It's like in specific by number and data. But what I do know that most of this support is coming from the European Union to support small scale initiatives, or comes directly from government support towards these UN agencies. In the region, I don't know, I can only speak about my own experience because we don't have these numbers in specific. Um, what I do know is that a lot of these small scale initiatives are underfunded, and they don't have the opportunity to be funded. Versus, and that's something we also spoke about earlier in that Arab Reform Initiative conversation last year, is the the justice when it comes to these local initiatives being funded, that a lot of them or a lot of the funding when it comes to climate issues and food issues are going to government projects, especially with the two solar energy projects that are happening in Morocco and in Egypt. And one of them, I think, is one of the biggest solar energy projects in the world, and that is being, or at least being, highly funded by the Climate Adaptation Fund, I think, from COP. And so there is that divide between governments being able to take most of the share of the funding that is coming from philanthropic support, but also from governments, and civil society organizations taking the small share of that. And we were talking here that governments, yes, projects are really important, but there's a lot of areas where government projects don't really linger into, which is consumption habits, working with people, speaking about those issues. Those are really driven by civil society organizations. Who is funding that in the region? I don't know, but most of the time we do hear that a lot of these organizations, and there are not too many, who are working on consumer behavior, alternative protein consumption, civil society rights, just transitions. These are led by civil society, and they're usually funded by European or like the European Union or global philanthropies. I do know, I mean, from my work with the CECG, SIF as well, the Rockefeller Foundation, and now we're also trying to bring aboard the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation as well into these projects, but they're still very small. And I mean, when we do sit with these philanthropies as well, they do ask for, big, large scale strategies that encompass the entire region. And some of these civil society organizations, they're really at a local level, and they haven't been able to expand their strategies to go beyond the local level to a national level, to a regional level. My personal need, or what I see that needs to be supported, is the advocacy part. For example, the national nutrition guidelines of each country, especially when it comes to the Mediterranean. We're losing that. We don't have an update towards that, and that needs advocacy. Holding our government accountable to the national pathways that are being drafted now towards the Food System Summit. That needs a movement. It needs a grassroots movement, just as is happening in other countries. I do see that happening very well in certain countries I visited or talked to, like Nigeria, Vietnam. Where else have we seen? Kenya as well. We've seen a lot of African grassroots level movements that are really being very well funded and are really holding their companies accountable against those. We can also see that the performance of these global South countries is improving much better and much faster than the global North countries because of these movements that are happening. Of course, that is anecdotal evidence at the end of the day, but we can attribute a lot their presence during these global spaces. So hence, a lot of these movements on the ground are asking, first of all, that the access and knowledge access to these philanthropic support that is at the global level, the know-how or to get to them is really difficult. Second is sometimes the global priorities are not really meeting the local priorities, and hence why they really need locally supported or regionally supported philanthropic support as well. Yeah.
Thank you. I wanted to pick up on, you kind of touched upon consumption, and at the start you'd said, there is a big production focus in the MENA region. And like in all the government policies and things, our consumption habits being talked about is kind of the role of, I guess, like corporate marketing as well, right? I wonder whether there's anything from your work at World Benchmarking Alliance that you're seeing of what kind of what kind of products are being marketed and sold in that region, and is that kind of an avenue of action to address kind of food sovereignty as well as healthier diets?
So this is also a global trend that we see, that communities are losing their indigenous consumption habits, especially in this region where they're losing their Mediterranean diet habits as well, and trying to switch more towards a Western diet. We do know that the influence of these companies, at least the front-facing or retail companies, is increasing. Their branches are increasing. The number of meals eating outside the house is increasing to to more than 3 times a week in the region as well. That is usually attributed to fast food chains as well, such as McDonald's and all of these. Is there a movement happening around that? When we spoke to the minister, and that was during like the parliamentarian consultations that we had, there is really no focus on that at all. And there is really an assumption from the ministers, especially when I sat down with the Minister of Agriculture in Jordan. There is that assumption that people's dietary habits are fine. The issue is supplying them with enough food. That's the entire story that we see. Um, Consumption isn't really looked at, and that has a lot to do with the idea that a lot of the food in the region is imported, so people can't really see the consequences of their dietary habits or their changing dietary habits on the environment and on climate. You can see that in Latin America a lot, because a lot of the food is sourced from the region itself, and a lot of the deforestation happens on the spot in those countries, so they can really see the interdependency and the footprints of their diets. But in a region where you have a desert, or I've had this conversation as well when I lived in Denmark with Scandinavian countries. They were asking me, why are you trying to tell the Danish people to eat diets that are or that use less fresh water? I mean, Scandinavia is very abundant with fresh water. Why do you have to, tell? There's no need. And hence why we went towards the virtual footprint of people's consumption habits. Most of the food that the Scandinavian people eat is attributed to deforestation, freshwater use, nitrogen use, all of this in other countries. So there is a global dependency on that. And that's something that we wanted to show people in the Mediterranean. We also want to try now to start working with medical doctors, hospitals, and like academic research institutes when it comes to nutrition, so that we can really see the trend in people's dietary habits and their health indicators as well. What is the attribute for or from the change in dietary habits towards people's deteriorating health? Do we see more obesity? Yes, we do know the data on undernourishment, hunger, and food insecurity. But like again, that's something we also discussed at the parliamentarian session. That's one part of the population. Yes, it is a big bulk of the population, but what about the rest of the population that is not food insecure? What's happening to them? I believe that the trend we expect to see is one part of the population is very food insecure, malnourished, and suffering from hunger. The other is leaning towards more obesity and overweight and non-communicable diseases at the same time. But the focus is always on those who are like food insecure and suffering from hunger as well. But we're trying to also show that there is also a bulk of the population that is not suffering from that food insecurity. What is happening over there? And there seems to be a blind eye on that topic for now.
Thank you. And I guess, kind of, given that you've been in the space for quite a few years, what are some of the little mindset shifts that you have seen? Like, what's the little bits of hope and change and adaptation that you've seen in the time that you've had, especially kind of in Lebanon, right? Because I feel that's kind of your area of expertise. And Erica, if you want to come in and ask your question or reflection too, then we've got both of them at the same time.
Yeah, I can do that. I guess I'm wondering, and I don't think there's not a single answer, but you know, we work with philanthropies that are not in this space. And so what's kind of a good entry point that seems accessible without kind of being overwhelming? Because I think we can go through these conversations and just spirals into one thing related to another thing, compounded by another thing, affecting something else. And so how do we break down that, you know, kind of feeling of immensity relating to this issue so that we can actually bring funders into the space? What would be a good entry point? And I don't think there's one single answer, but I guess I'm thinking about always how we do that without, like, how do we bring people in without scaring them away, I guess. Thanks.
Exactly. I think I'll answer both questions with one answer. Let me speak about my personal experience and showing where the positive trend is being seen. My work with youth-led organizations, especially in the Middle East and North Africa, is where I'm gonna reflect on. Before, a few years back, that movement of youth-led organizations in food systems was lacking. It was really not present when it came to the MENA. We started to join the global movements from a regional level or from a national level. Now we are at a moment where we have organizations that are completely youth-led that are from the region. One example is the MENA Youth Network, specifically working on food systems. I think you have Nishad coming up later on as well. He can share, probably not on food systems, more on climate, but you can also see a trend from what he will be talking about. The biggest accomplishment I've seen is the ability to really put pressure on the national conveners of these countries to participate as a minimum, because that's something we weren't really seeing when you go to these global spaces like the Food System Summit, the World Food Forum, COP, that our national conveners and representatives were not really present at these spaces. And so now we're at a moment where, yes, we can hold campaigns at the national level where the national conveners really listen to us. We're at the table and we really ask them to be present at these global spaces and take into consideration the youth priorities. The national convener of Lebanon has been super supportive for now in terms of including youth priorities, civil society thought, into the national pathway that they are trying to draft. And so that's the area where I'm seeing the biggest positive trend, is that a movement of young experts is emerging into the policy space. Now, yes, it is an advocacy policy space, but yet again, it is very much needed. We were calling against band-aid solutions and a lot of ministerial sessions as well. And now we do have programs that are specifically being done for youth-led entrepreneurship, trying to fund youth to become experts in the field of food systems as well. So we are really trying to build a movement of young people within food systems. The most important is building the narrative around food systems, that it is not only about food production and having enough food to eat. It's also about a healthy diet. It's also about the rights and livelihoods of the farmers and fishers. It's also about the nutrition and health of people, the climate, the biodiversity loss. I think that narrative is really changing, and we've been able to do that through the advocacy of these youth-led organizations from the regional level to the global level. Now, I'm not saying that at the regional level there are no specific or unique issues, but what we have noticed is that although they are special, they're really not unique. A lot of countries around the world do share a lot of that. And we've seen the backlash actually at COP events from people from Afghanistan saying that, you know, your issues are not unique, they're special, but we all share similar issues when it comes to food insecurity and conflict, for example. So that's why we're trying to have a global outlook, but trying to get those examples from a local level. So that's where I see really like the biggest improvement. I can't really speak about other areas where there is a trend of improvement or where do you jump in to support? I can speak from my experience only, to be very factual here.
Thank you. And I guess this point of the lack of data being collected keeps coming up, right? And I think,
Yes.
you know, I think AFF as an organization as well is trying to push for better and more data collection so that we can make informed decisions. Just a reflection on that. And I guess the other question that I was holding, given kind of your experiences with COP processes and kind of food system summits and things, what hope and what fear are you holding when it comes to food security and food systems in the region and COP28 coming up?
That's a very big question. At least, first of all, when it comes to COP, now our focus is to try to have the adaptation agenda being or considering the MENA region. We want the Climate Adaptation Fund to consider adaptation needs for the MENA region. That includes all the funding that would go into countries where they are prone to climate disasters, where their food security, and we do know that the MENA region is one of the regions that is most affected by climate change. And so we do think that it should have its cut of the Climate Adaptation Fund when it comes to efficient technologies, as we spoke about at the beginning of the session, as well as subsidies for farmers and fiscal policies for consumers. Why am I saying this from an advocacy side? Because unfortunately, the politics comes into hand again. The countries who are pouring the funds into the Climate Adaptation Fund decide which countries they want to provide the adaptation funds to. For example, if I'm country X, I say I want to give $10 billion to country Y for adaptation as part of my commitment to the Climate Adaptation Fund. Why does country X provide those funds for country Y? It's usually for, you know, continuing on their economic relations together. It has a lot to do with the politics of country X and country Y. It's not really a scientific assessment of, oh, okay, country Y is really in need of climate adaptation, so we must pour into. There is no equity or equality perspective when it comes to it. It's more of a decision of country X choosing which country to provide adaptation funds. So I think that's the most important part when it comes to COP. For the Food System Summit, from a youth side again, we are trying to bring funds from the FAO directly to support on-the-ground youth initiatives in the MENA region. That is something that we're really hopeful about. Again, from a policy side, we're trying to hold the national conveners of the MENA countries accountable against the commitments that they set out in their national pathways. If they don't have a national pathway yet, that is the area where we focus on. You must have a national pathway. There must be accountability. That's what we're trying to work on. Yeah.
Thank you. You've answered a very complex question in a very short and concise way. We've got 5 minutes left. Does anybody have anything else that they want to share, reflect back, ask?
Just a little request, Ray, and earlier you mentioned that we're seeing a lot of grassroots organizations in some countries doing really well to hold government accountable. I think you mentioned Vietnam, you mentioned Nigeria. I'd love to sort of get those organizations from you as a case study. Fascinating.
Sure thing. So the way we heard about these was obviously, so for example, for Vietnam, there was the food systems pre-stock taking moment. So there's the stock taking moment, then there's the pre-stock taking moment that happens a few months before the actual stock take. For Southeast Asia, the location was Vietnam, so we all went there. And then the local initiatives, we saw Grow Asia, the International Farmers Organization, and some other Vietnamese, their name is in Vietnamese, so it was difficult for me to remember their names, but They were all grouped together inside the pre-summit, and they really were discussing and pushing forward, pushing forward the narrative of farmers' livelihoods, especially when it comes to commodity agriculture, when it comes to rice production and palm oil. That was the biggest issue for them. That's what they were trying to hold their governments against, is that their pathways must reflect the livelihoods of the farmers within those supply chains. But from one end, you have at the global level, everybody saying monoculture is really bad. Palm oil production at an industrial scale is bad for the environment, is bad for biodiversity. Same thing for rice. But the livelihood of these farmers really depends on them. And the farmers from Vietnam were really not okay with how the conversation was going, because they felt that the trend and policy was going towards, okay, we'll try to end the industrial monoculture production without looking at a just transition for these farmers. So then we also went to Thailand, where we also saw examples from Corn Bank. That's a bank based in Thailand, and they have a foundation called Corn Foundation, where they're really trying to work on a just transition with these farmers, because these farmers are really destroying the forests in the northern provinces of Thailand so that they can grow corn as cattle fields to be sent to Western countries. And so they were saying, provide us with a better economic solution, with a better option for us, and we will happily stop deforesting the lands. And so the narrative was changing from farmers are destroying the land for profit into farmers saying, hey, we don't care what we produce as long as it's profitable and good for our livelihood. Provide us with the solution and we'll happily stop doing whatever we're doing. But when we are living in poverty situations in areas that are extremely rural, and this is our only option, really. And also, when we had the national convener of Malaysia step in as well and discuss this, and he was saying that a lot of the livelihoods, a lot of the people who really went out of the poverty line in Malaysia was attributed to palm oil production. And so, again, coming back into just transition, those stories, the narrative, bridging the gap between on the ground narratives, local grassroots, and government policy is where I see a lack at the global level, but in specific in the MENA region.
Something that sticks out for me that you mentioned was, it sounds like a secret ingredient to really getting these voices and these voices heard was that they came together, right? And it just comes back to me to what we've heard previously around the MENA region, which is this real importance of supporting civil society and helping to build up that civil society voice in the face of security issues, in the face of the shifting government. But yeah, no, thank you. It just comes back to that every time for me in the MENA region.
Exactly. I mean, when you sit down with the Arab Reform Initiative, I hope that they talk to you about this, but everybody who was joined together either in Tunisia or in Lebanon spoke about this issue, that there is a lot of things going on. They are underfunded, but the most the biggest thing is they want a platform to convene together to build a movement, because everybody is working very separately. And that's the issue. They want better communication. They want access to data that we spoke that is lacking as well. And they want a platform for all of them to convene together. That's why you feel like they're all dissociated and they are joining the global movements, because they can't see the relationship at a regional level because of a lack of conveners. You need somebody to convene a platform, communication, provide the data that is accessible to everyone. That's what they're looking for, basically.
Amazing. Thanks, Ryan. That's a great call to action, right? A philanthropic fund or funding from AFF kind of members and partners being able to go towards creating spaces like that. Because it seems like we spoke to Sareen last week, and it definitely was the theme coming out of, we need space that is safe and that is kind of plentiful to be able to play and think together and create kind of new ideas and ways of working and addressing the issues that we're facing. So thank you on that note. And with that, I'll round it up as we are on the hour. But thank you so much for sharing so generously with us today. I think there's some really great kind of takeaways around the policy work, the international and the regional differences that we're seeing, and really that need to invest in youth and advocacy in civic spaces, and bringing back food to the region for the region. Thank you so much.